Hey everyone, it's Michelle Lim here again. Thanks so much for everyone that's still subscribing and commenting on my videos. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry that I haven't had much chance to make any new videos in a while or like any other videos. I actually became really famous and I have not had time. No, that's not true. I have not become famous yet, but I really appreciate everyone still like watching my video about the top 5 do's and don'ts for open mic comedy, and I really like everyone commenting on my videos and people are still subscribing, which is really cool. So that video was made probably like 3 or 4 years ago. I was pretty new to comedy. I don't think I'd done a solo show yet, but since then I've done like 3 solo shows. I just did the Melbourne Comedy Festival in Melbourne, which was awesome this year, and yeah, I'm just kind of trying to work my craft. So I have a list of topics that I want to go through with you guys, for kind of comedy tips. And if you guys have any other questions that you want to ask me, please feel free to put them in the comment section below, and hopefully I can address those in another video. So I have lots of different different categories I want to go through, but today I thought I would go through like the wording of a joke, because I think it's a good lead on from the open mic do's and don'ts. So now you've had 3 years to practice your open mic do's and don'ts, and now we're going to get into like the nitty gritty of joke writing. So I guess with this, I wanted to start out by thinking about what makes a joke funny. And I think that jokes fall into 2 main categories. The first one is something that is kind of like a really funny story that has a very unpredictable ending. And it's like a true story, or it could be like, loosely based on a true story, but it's funny because you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened in the end. That was really funny, right? The other thing that, the other category that jokes fall into is like it's funny because it's true category. Like when people always have comedy shows and then you can hear people in the audience being like, oh my God, that's so funny because it's true. So that's like the other category. I think that when you're writing a joke, it's very important for you to get your ideas across in as few words as possible. So you pretty much want to give the audience enough information to understand like the point that you're trying to get across, but in as few words as possible so that it doesn't get too wordy and too kind of like long-winded. So I think that audiences, comedians that can really write like a really good and tight joke, like a really concise joke, they are the comedians that do really well because they're explaining this like concept, what's the word that I'm looking for? They're explaining these complex ideas in a really simple way, right? And they get their message across really clearly. And that's why when you listen to people and they say that, the comic wasn't very good because they just swore a lot or they just use crass imagery, you call that like a cheap joke. You're like, oh man, that was just such a cheap joke because it wasn't like funny and it wasn't smart and the audience didn't have to think about anything to get the punchline. It was just kind of like they swore or they had this really crude punchline and the audience is just laughing because, it is funny, but it's not like intellectually stimulating. So yeah, the wedding is very important with a joke. If we talk about the first category, like the funny story category, the wedding is not as important because it's like basically a funny story that the audience is going along for. So it's not a concept that you're trying to explain. It's just like a recount of an event, right? But obviously the wedding is still like you don't want to go on and on and on with this funny story. Like you want to make sure that it's short and sharp and you get to the punchline pretty quickly. But wedding is not as important. If you're talking about a joke where you're trying to explain like a funny concept and it's one of those, oh, it's funny because it's true, then the wedding is very important because otherwise it's just like you're saying a statement, which is really obvious that everybody already knows. So what you want to do is you basically want to say it in a way that describes the situation as clearly as possible, but there's like a little gap in the joke so that you're not explaining the full situation. Like if you just explain the full situation, it's not a joke. Everyone's going to be like, yeah, that's like super obvious. We already know that. You want to explain in a way that leaves like a little gap so that once you deliver the punchline, the audience has to like take a moment and then it comes like full circle and they're like, oh yeah, that's really funny because it's true. So that's basically what you want to do. So I have a couple of examples from my own jokes that I wanted to share with you. So if you don't like these jokes, whatever, other people like them, so good on me. No, so I have a couple of jokes, and I mean, like, everyone has these are just examples. So I hope that this kind of explains the concept that I'm trying to explain to you. What you want to do is you want to give information throughout the joke, but you want to have the most of the information like at the end, like the most clear bit of information at the end of the joke. So I have two examples for you. The first one is a joke that I do about TV in Australia. So in Australia, we have lots of reality TV shows. We've got a show called Bondi Rescue, which is basically filmed at Bondi Beach, and they pretty much just film surf lifesavers saving people who are going to drown. Okay, and like mostly the people that are drowning are like, tourists that are not familiar with Bondi and like the waves and like, it's like a very dangerous beach because of all the rip tides and stuff like that, right? So they're not really familiar with it. They're tourists and they usually, nearly end up drowning, but then they get saved. Okay, so that's the first show, and then the second show is a show called Border Security, which I'm sure like everyone has. It's like this other reality TV show. It's filmed at the airport, and they're always trying to like trapping people who are trying to bring in like snakes or like drugs, or they have overstayed their visa and they need to leave the country, right? On both of these shows, there are always heaps of Asian people on these shows. Okay, it's pretty embarrassing. I don't know. Anyway, there's lots of Asian people on the show. So if I went on stage and I said like, oh, like what's with all the reality TV shows in Australia, like Bondi Rescue and Border Security? Why are there so many Asians on these shows? That's just like a statement, and everyone knows that already. So it's like a very obvious statement. It's not a joke because it's like, yeah, exactly. But yeah, there's nothing like funny about it, right? So what I do is like when I go on stage, I go like, I'm sick of seeing all these shows on TV. Like TV's so shit right now. Like what do we have on TV? We've got Bondi Rescue, Border Security. Man, I'm sick of seeing my relatives on TV. So I don't say anything about Asian people. Like I'm Asian, obviously. So when they see me, and then I say I'm sick of seeing my relatives on TV, then the audience can make that connection themselves. Like, oh, because there are like so many Asian people on those shows. Like, oh, that's funny. So that's the first joke that I wanted to share with you. And also, like, I think people always ask me how I write my jokes. I don't actually sit down and write jokes. I just kind of notice things around the world, or like I have a conversation with someone, and then I'll think of something funny, and then I'll just like write it down and try to come up with a joke later. So, but everybody writes jokes differently, so you can do whatever you want. The other joke that I wanted to share with you is a joke about the weatherman. So I've always wanted to write a joke about the weatherman. I've never really known how to write it properly. So basically, my concept was I don't like the weatherman because he's the only person in the world that can keep like not doing his job properly, but he still manages to keep his job because the weatherman's always wrong. Like he'll be like, it's sunny tomorrow, don't bring an umbrella, and then tomorrow's rainy. And bloody weatherman just keeps his job anyway, like he doesn't care. There's like no repercussions for the weatherman giving bad advice. So I kind of tried to do that joke in a couple of different ways. Like the first way I was thinking about doing it was about saying something like, like imagine if I had the same ideas as the weatherman, and instead of me coming in with my sales reports and just being like, oh, the sales this year are going to be like 20% higher than last year, and then it was like 5%, and then like I don't know. See, that's not very funny because it's kind of like it's true, but it's not really funny because there's no punchline, and it's a very obvious way of like saying that joke, right? So instead, what I say now is like, oh, there's this guy at work. His name's Tom. He's super annoying. Okay. I call him the weatherman because his reports are always wrong, but he still manages to keep his job. And that's more like, oh, that's funny. It's not like as obvious as the first way I said it, where I was like, oh, explaining about the weatherman first, and then I go into like the segue about my job, and like imagine if I was the weatherman, because it's just too long, right? And people aren't gonna, they're not gonna find that very funny. So I hope that explains how to write a joke a little bit better. I'm sorry, it's not really a precise science. It's more like a science and an art. But I wanted to explain the concept that I go through, because sometimes people like, they're always coming up to me and be like, oh, I've got this idea for a joke. It's going to be really funny. But it's not funny because it's just obvious. You got to make, I'm sure your friends go up to you and say like, oh, this is going to be a really funny joke. Why don't you make a joke about this, right? And you got to think like, okay, that's like an observation. Like everybody can see that is whatever the observation is, right? And then you got to think, okay, so how do I make it in a way that it's not stating the obvious? Oh, that was concise. Yeah, not stating the obvious, right? So you got to think about that, and hopefully figure out a way to explain a concept in as few words as possible, with a little gap, so that the audience has to make that connection themselves. And once they make it, then they're like, oh, that's really funny, right? Don't treat the audience like they're stupid. Don't over explain jokes. Just give them enough information and let them do it themselves, right? Because the audience likes that. They don't want to have to go into a comedy show and then have people explain, like, over explain the jokes, because then it's, people, yeah. Anyway, the audience really likes it when you make them feel clever. So make your audience feel clever and you do really well. All right, that was my segment on joke writing. Maybe I'll write another one. If you have any more questions about like the wording, please let me know. And I will see you next time. I'm really excited. I'm going to try to get a lot of these like videos done for you guys. All right, thank you. Bye.